Welcome back, everybody, after your break. What a rich and varied day it's been so far. I'm just sort of sitting here reflecting on the day, starting with Divine's keynote and the conversation with Kim, and then the four sessions I sat in with, and aware that there were other sessions going on as well. So thank you to well, everybody really, the presenters, but also those that have engaged in the chat and the dialogue and the conversations. So we've got a session now until 4:15. Have we got Michelle as well? Brilliant. Okay, so we've got we've got our four panelists, most of whom I think are familiar to you from today, but I'm going to invite them to just sort of say a few words, each of them themselves first. I'm just going to invite them in a minute each, either to just reflect on the theme of the day, or perhaps their experience of the day so far, just very briefly. And then this session until 4:15 will be an opportunity for the panelists to maybe discuss some of those things with one another, and also to discuss with the audience. Okay, so I think we would all welcome you to use the chat function, and I'll try and facilitate the chat the dialogue if it needs facilitation. It'd probably be really helpful if in the chat, if it's kind of clear whether you're whether it's a comment or actually a question. So if there's a way that you can indicate whether you'd actually like to come in and ask the question, that would be really helpful from me. So anyway, I'm just going to go around as we see them. So I'm going to pass on to the person next to me, which happens to be you, Divine. Could I just ask you to take a minute or two to, where are you at right here, right now, in terms of the theme of the day or your reflections on the day?
Thank you very much. Well, it's been such a wonderful day. I feel really inspired. I feel really moved. I think my reflections earlier hold in terms of, I think I put in the chat earlier the quote from the Cuban-American anthropologist Ruth Beha, which says that one thing remains constant about our humanity, that we must never stop trying to tell our stories of who we think we are, and we must never stop wanting to listen to each other. If we ever stopped, it would all be over. And I think having attended Kim's talk and a few of the presentations this afternoon, three things that I want to bullet point. The first that's run right across is our capacity to take risk, to tell our stories, and to dare to step forward. That's number one. The second thing is the centrality of this use of self, that it's really at the heart of any of the work that we're doing and the research that we're doing. And the third thing that I want to say, which is kind of a hobby horse of mine, is to encourage us to not only do the research, but dissemination and publication, and to really take pride in that. So I think that's my 2 minutes up, but I'm really moved by all the talks I've attended, and it's been such a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Divine, both for your brevity, but also, getting those sort of three clear points across, really helpful. Thank you. Kim, could I invite you to speak for a minute or two, please? If you just unmute first, Kim.
Yes. Yes, I've been really happy to think that this is the theme that you've chosen for today, and that this is what your students are really being encouraged to think about and work with and be. The power of the stories that people have told today. And what I'm very conscious of, and one of the presentations I went to really named this, it's not just the doing the research, it's the telling the story of doing the research that helps us to become more of who we are. And that the more we do that, the more opportunities we take to do that, whether at presentations or in the written word. the more that helps us to do that becoming. And that's been very evident in the work I've seen today. So for me, using I, we have to come out from behind the sort of cloak of anonymity, and we have to take responsibility for our views, our decisions and interpretations. And I think that's really important, that we kind of stand up and own who we are and what we think and how we go about this work. It's particularly important because from an ethical point of view, I think we have to be transparent about the ethical decisions that we make, so that others can learn from them. And so often, research writing is sanitized. It's all been wonderful and there's not been any terrible sticky moments or difficulties, but it's really important for us to include that. So yes, I think that's all I want to say at the moment. I'm just very clear from today is that it creates an opportunity for personal growth, not just for us as researchers, but also for our participants. And that's why, we're working for what we call transformational research.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. And perhaps you might each want to pick up points that each other makes once you've each spoken, if that's okay. If I could invite Michelle to go next. For those of you that don't know Michelle, Michelle has been a tutor at Sherwood for many years in the past, isn't any longer, but you did create the research showcase several years ago, and we're really thrilled to have you back. So Michelle, over to you.
It's lovely to be back. Thank you. As Richard said, I trained at the Sherwood. I taught at the Sherwood for a number of years. I'm now teaching at Metanoia and for the Open University, and I'm doing my research into weight stigma and size affirmative psychotherapy with the Open University. I guess the things that I've really been struck with today from Divine's presentation this morning, Divine's keynote, was that idea of our passion and how our passion and our wonder fits into research, but that fits on a whole spectrum of emotions that we use within research, but also that not ignoring the horrible nature of what goes on in the world and not losing hope from that, and knowing that we've got a small part in making change alongside all of our amazing colleagues here. That feels really important and really authentic to kind of sit with that as an idea. And from Kim's work, that idea that our self is central in that work, and that we use our own intersections of privilege and marginalization to bring ourselves to research. That feels really important to me also, and I'm really excited to think about how I bring that to my own PhD research as well on an ongoing basis. And then it's just so wonderful to see old colleagues here, or recent colleagues, and to catch up with people, and wonderful to see Alan on the panel as well, and to see old colleagues research, which has all been really inspirational today. So thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. It's fantastic to have you, Michelle. Thank you. And Alan, for those of you that don't know Alan, he's a therapist and currently actively researching as well, a researcher and a tutor at the Sherwood Institute. So we're delighted to have you on the panel, Alan. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And I guess as I'm sitting here, what I'm noticing is, in terms of a researcher, being what I would see as being one of the youngest amongst us, and kind of feeling myself, noticing the sense of how can I contribute to a panel with such great experience and academic professionalism behind the other members. And what crossed my mind, Kim, is something that you said around we've all got a story, or how interpreting that my story is equally valid. It's my story and you have stories, and we all have stories, and that really shifted it from a more of a hierarchical, how can I be present at this table, and yet we can all be present at this table, whether there are first year students here to seasoned researchers here. We've all got stories, and I guess that's what I bring to this panel today.
Thank you, Alan. That's really good to hear. Yeah, I'm really glad to hear you valuing your voice in that. Yeah, thank you. Before maybe we sort of open up to the audience, as it were, although do feel free to write in the chat at any point. I wonder if any of the panelists would like to respond to what other panelists have said in their opening remarks.
I don't mind. I don't mind to start. I guess I've just jotted a few notes down as we've been talking, but I was thinking about that capacity to take risk in research, and quite often we try to, and I know when we're training, we often trainees might think, oh, we need to account for every ethical responsibility in every ethical scenario. And I'm thinking about Tim Bond's paper, which is quite a few years old, about not rewriting the rules of relationship towards a new ethic of trust, where he's talking about relationship as inherently risk taking. And it just really makes me think about research as an inherently risk taking activity. And I'm thinking about some of the research that you've done, Kim, and how you've really fought for your place in the academy, but also some of the risks that you've taken in doing research in a different way. And that feels really aspirational, but that idea of risk is inevitable in research, it feels really important to hold and is central to using ourselves in research.
If you unmute, Kim.
I've never quite got over that. Oh, I've done it again. I've put my head above the parapet, waited for the flak. And, it's so delightful because I don't get the flak, I actually get such a lot of affirmation. So the risk is really worth it. And, that helps to carry on and to be confident about a voice. And so I want other people to have that opportunity, to stick their heads above the parapet and publish and be damned. And, it might not happen.
And I was thinking about what maybe I don't know that we named enough, which is some of the limitations and of our methods, our methodologies, and the challenges. And I'm reminded of that because when we're talking about risk, I'm thinking about the parallel process that perhaps as a supervisor, if I think about myself, I need to also trust in the process when somebody has got the passion and the research, that I don't take the safe options of, yeah, if you do A, B, C, D, then you qualify on time, or if they're holding back, that I can wonder with them in wonderment and curiosity, and thinking about how can we take risk and to do what my colleagues have said about, like Alan, power with rather than power over, and Michelle and Kim speaking about the risk taking. I think that's important. And lastly, the learning that continues and the reflection that continues in the learning. So thank you.
Yeah.
It brings to mind something of maybe another aspect is one of self-disclosure as well. The kind of risk-taking that is involved in, I think, Kim, you just sort of alluded to that a little bit, and I'm aware, Michelle and Alan, in your talks, unfortunately, Alan, I didn't attend your talk, but I wonder if there's something in that you'd like to respond to.
So, Richard, if you were asking me, so I guess what the tension I'm carrying in self-disclosure is a frame from my training which talks about, rightly so, in terms of self-disclosure being in the service to the client. I'm holding a position in terms of working from a human development perspective, developmentally, in terms of holding my story back to create a space in which to facilitate or meet, using the language, unmet relational needs or adaptations, versus being fully present. And owning my story. And I guess what I'm struggling to figure out is how to hold those positions concurrently. So is this an adaptation to how I practice from a developmental space, or is there a meta way of just holding it all together so that I'm not denying my story, but when I'm working in a developmental way, it's held way from the front? I guess is a question I'm curious about. I don't know the answer to.
Yes, it's about the judicious use of self, isn't it? That it's got to matter in a way to the research. Yeah, and you know, we're asking our clients to self-disclose, and we're publishing what they say to us. And this whole, you know, the feminist ethic that keeps me going is that of, you know, having the recognition of the power inequality and the need to equalize that in whatever way we can. We can never get rid of the power imbalance between the client and the researcher entirely, but we need to own that. But also, you know, not to mind if something, if somebody disagrees or in some way, you know, dismisses something, because we're not claiming the truth. We're not claiming to be the expert. We're just, you know, speaking our particular view or our truth on that matter. So yes, it's risky, but I think it's more risky if we think that we have an unassailable right to be taken seriously and that that's the truth. And, you know, certainly in the philosophical position that I adopted, that's not how it is. You know, that there are many truths and many realities and multiple selves, and that's quite, you know, relieving in some ways, because you don't have to be the expert.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, could I bring Michelle in, I think, on the same question? And then it might be good to open up to the audience. I noticed Julie Faulkner has asked a question. Michelle.
I think my comment was really following on from that, and I was curious maybe what Alan thought, or what anybody thinks about. I was thinking about how you speak about disclosure, Alan, and that idea that in some respects we have a choice whether to disclose or not. But what about those aspects of self that we don't have a choice about disclosing? So blackness or fatness, or that are automatically in the room in our physicality, or maybe a visible disability, and how I'm curious how that fits in your research, and how maybe it fits in your thinking, Divine and Kim.
Yeah, I think I need to give a bit more thought to that.
I think I have a framework that talks about the gift of invisibility and the gift of visibility. And in some ways, there are things that we can't escape because they're in the frame. And it's how we, and I think this is the key, the aspect of the relational, how we approach it with sensitivity, with curiosity, with naming, without avoiding, and the whole time discerning our intentionality. What is my intention? What is being said? What's not being said? I think the Native Americans have an idea of rivers within rivers. So if you're standing in a river, even if it dries, there's another river underneath, and and it's never the same. It's always moving. Mm-hmm. And I think our capacity to be fully present, to be curious, and again, we're back to risk, to dare to take the risk and to name. And I just wrote the last thing I'll say here, which begins to feed into what you're saying, and the question that's been asked in the chat is how we might demystify what it means to share one's experience. What does that mean? You know, which aspect of the experience, and where does it go from there? And ideas about power with rather than power over. So it becomes a co-creation. Yeah, thank you.
Can I bring it back to you, Alan? Because it originated with a question from yourself, and then I'll maybe invite Julie in. Don't know if she wants to sort of come on and unpack her question a bit, or just leave it as it is. But Alan, what's going on for you?
Two things really. So what I'm noticing is I think Kim, you referred to it. So my original thinking and having trained as an engineer, and how I'm still making that translation from the answer to multiple answers, and how that emerges within these early questions. But actually something divine that you were saying in terms of, and Michelle, if I'm picking up what you're saying, is kind of like it's those things that are visible about me. I can't stop being a man, so I just name them, just own them, just be with that is seen. But I have a choice in terms of what I share about that is not seen, but I share it as from an experiential this is who I am. I'm not saying it's better than or worse than, it just is who I am, and not adding a value judgment to it, just putting it out there.
Thank you, Alan. And I think, Julie, could I invite you in if you'd like to, or?
Yes, I can come in.
Yeah,
thank
thanks.
you. Here I am. It's weird to see a face suddenly appear. How bizarre. I don't know if I have anything to add. It's just something that came into my awareness today, how tricky it is to find people when we're asking big questions. Somehow it's becoming harder, it feels, that putting out something and having maybe we're talking about shame, maybe we're talking about overwhelm in the world as it is at the moment. But any wisdom that can be gleaned from this panel about ways of thinking about how we find these people to help us in our research endeavour. It seems they're elusive.
That's really interesting, Julie, because I haven't found that. So I was a bit, and when I saw your question, I was reading it in a slightly different way. I thought it was about the risk for participants, co-researchers, the ones that we have. I didn't realize you were, yeah, but I can see how those two things might go together. But I think it's really important for us to point out the risks to our participants, because so often they're not, you know, people can be very gung-ho about taking part and be very kind of tiggerish. Yes, oh yes, I'd like to do that. I'm thinking particularly of, in my narrative approaches book, when I did the work with the two brothers who'd been abused, in chapter 22, I've devoted that to the whole ethical conversation that we had, a dialogical ethics, in which we discuss things like that. And one of the struggles I had was that they had come from a position of this deep shame, you know, actually had gone to another city to find a book on male sexual abuse, because they didn't want to be seen in their own locality, even looking at the bookshelves. And they got to this point some years after the therapy, when we were doing to do this project together, where they didn't feel that anymore. And one of them said, oh, I don't mind, I can shout it from the rooftops. And my sort of warning bells were ringing a bit, you know. And then there was this delicate conversation about whether they put their name on the book, which, you know, from my point of view, in terms of equality and power, of course, you know, that would feel important. But on the other hand, it also feel overexposing, potentially. So we had to open up that conversation about, you know, what would it mean to have your names on the book? We really had to have a long, in-depth discussion about that. And one of them said to me afterwards, oh, it's much more complicated than I first realized. And, you know, if you hadn't explained that to me and I'd just gone ahead, I might have felt abused later. And you know, it just feels like that's we sometimes, often, usually know more about that than the participants. And I think that's part of our responsibility and power, to share that knowledge of, you know, what could possibly happen. It doesn't mean to say it would, but for them to make an informed decision about whether or not to use their names, they have to know what they're choosing between. And also that whole thing about how is it going to affect you now, some years after the therapeutic process, just to revisit this and to speak again about something that's been so painful and difficult. So we had to really open that up. I don't think you can do that on an informed consent form. You know, I think the dialogical ethics is really essential when we're using people's stories for our research. And we have to ask ourselves the same questions. You know, what's it mean for me to, because, you know, the participants can remain anonymous, but my name is on it and I'm telling my personal story. And what will that mean? What will that mean for my children? What will that mean for my husband? What will that mean for me in the future, 10 years hence? So it's a big issue. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to think and talk about that. But I haven't personally had the problem of not being able to find participants, I have to say.
Just very briefly in response to that, what you've said has kind of triggered a thought in me about how we make those initial contacts and how we communicate our intentions.
Yeah.
And the process involved in making a decision, of making it much more easy for people to feel their way than to put their hand up and then they're in. Yeah.
And to keep doing that, you know, to check, does this still feel okay? Is this something you really want to go ahead with? Because at the beginning, you know, the enthusiasm to the project or the newness of the idea might, you know, engage people who, I think it's really important to keep asking that question right up to the end, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Kim. And I see Michelle wants to come in on this as well.
Yes, sorry, I guess I was thinking about, I wonder if there are any assumptions about the size of the sample that we need as well, that that more is better. And I'm thinking about what Kim was saying earlier on about the fact of a detailed qualitative account of in-depth experience, and how the rationale that we need to give is around, you know, this is equally as valid as a randomized controlled trial with however many people. I guess the other question that maybe I had in response to Julie was, I wonder if it's an indication of the age that we're in, where if we put ourselves out there, we can make ourselves vulnerable to online trolling, or you know, all the stuff that's been in the news recently, that somehow we're exposed to that whole other level of insidious behavior that is going on in society, and that's before your participants or your potential participants have even thought about how they might be involved. They might start thinking about what the consequences of putting myself out there, without even knowing that they're going to be anonymous in that process.
Thank you, Michelle. And Divine.
Yeah, thank you. Agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I want to say a few things that are practical matters that helped me when I was studying out. But the other bit is, say, the direction I've taken my research. So for me, it's kind of location and identifying where I might be able to meet the people, the colleagues, the participants with the stories that I'm interested in or that I share. The other thing is around collaboration, and really a lot of my research now, I don't have in the last 2 years a research topic apart from one that I've researched that is still in the original question that I asked. I use a lot of participant public groups now where I go to a group and I say, this is an idea I have about this kind of story. What do you think? And many times, including just 2 months ago with veterans on trauma research, they said, well, that's not a very good question to ask for this reason, A, B, C, D. And actually, it was so helpful that if I had just gone, and so that co-creation is important. And the last thing I'll share is around just around informed consent, and really seconding what my colleagues Kim and Michelle said about as an ongoing process, actually. And at times as a verbal consent, like with refugees and asylum seekers that we've worked with, they will not sign anything on paper because of past use. So there's a whole thing about just keep checking, is this still okay? Is this still okay? And if it isn't, it's not a problem. So I wanted to share some of those practical, but also the public patient, public groups just really help to toy with the idea and to change. If I ask this question, am I missing something in what I'm interested in? So it's not a doing to, but it's a co-creative process. Thank you. Thank you.
And if I could bring Alan in as well, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, so for me, having gone through the programs, I also wonder about an opportunity within the program to reflect on the methods that are taught and whether there's space to expand them to include more narrative thinking or more socially constructive positions, so that we move beyond IPA heurism grounded theory into maybe autoethnography or maybe narrative inquiry, to expand what's available so that we can, it's less about, as Michelle was saying, the number of participants, but rather the depth of the stories that we're drawing out.
Julie, would you like to respond to any of what you've heard?
Lots of food for thought. Thank you. And in a parallel process, I feel like I want my face to disappear and give someone else some space.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
thank you for the richness. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And I've been noticing, sorry, Kim.
I'm just noticing in the chat that's given me an understanding of why Julie asked that question about the training organization being perhaps a little bit risk averse in allowing participants to come from outside the small pool of often fellow therapists. I totally agree with that. I think it becomes very incestuous if you're not careful. And as the person, as Nick says, you know, therapists have probably been chewing these things over for years and have reified their narrative. And so there's a lack of freshness in that. You know, they've been beating up about it in therapy for 3 years while they've been in training or something like that. And yes, wow, I didn't realize that was why it was so hard, but I can totally understand that now.
Thank you for drawing our attention to the chat there, Kim. And I wonder if that's a nice prompt to open up to the audience. Would anybody like to step into the space and join in the discussion with the panel? Please put up your hand or just switch on your mic and start speaking.
Catherine. Hi, Richard. I guess that point about using other therapists to do your MSc research, it sort of like undermined my attempts to get published a little bit, because when I submitted them to the BACP journal, they said, oh, well, you're doing a descriptive phenomenological approach, but you've used therapists who have been like sort of like chewing over this for ages. How can you possibly call that a natural sort of like capture of it? So that was quite disappointing, really, that it made the research that I'd done discredited in that respect.
Well, that's a shame. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah. Any other comments about this particular topic? Otherwise, I have been sent a question in advance that I'm happy to go to.
Can I just check, Richard? Is that is that issue about not going to other therapists in researching therapists' experience or perspective? Is it about an ethics process that students go through? What is that about? I don't know, it may not need to be answered here, but I suppose that's, to me, seems to be really important. What is the barrier to people being able to think about who are the most appropriate participants for my research?
I think it's a really valuable discussion to be having, and to be having within programs and, you know, at the Institute here, because, you know, sort of I'm involved in the ethical approval process here, and, you know, sort of, and read people's research proposals and sort of give advice, and we have discussions about it. And I think continually reviewing our stance on this, because I think it is an ethical thing. I suppose we want to, I suppose like Kim was alluding to, you know, sort of sometimes clients can be a bit gung-ho, I think was the phrase you used, about joining in research. And, you know, when I've done research out in the community, sort of, for example, with Mind, sometimes people positively want to have their names out there because they've been so marginalized and so stripped of their voice that they really actually want to have their, you know, sort of, and we've ended up taking people to research conferences, you know, within the UK and abroad. And that's felt really valuable, I think, to include co-researchers and participants. So I think where there is a reluctance to approve projects on those grounds, I think it would be really healthy to have those discussions and challenge them. And, you know, I think as an institute, we've got to really consider, you know, what are we advising students? Yeah,
I guess if we think about it on a really, if we were taking a really hard line social justice stance, the question might be, if therapy is a generally middle class white profession, largely populated by female therapists, then how are we perpetuating marginalization by not hearing the voices outside of that sample? Sorry, I'm the stories of the people that are outside of that population. So I guess it could be argued that in some way we're perpetuating marginalization through that process. So just popping that.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And there was a question in my mind today at one of the presentations where I was thinking how much more valuable this study would have been if you've been asking clients instead of fellow therapists. And I did wonder about that, but yeah. Linda said the same last year, apparently. Well, I think, you know, it's totally valid for somebody who wants to be named in their research to be named. I think the important thing is to discuss it thoroughly and to look at the consequences. I did a study of trauma of the body and transformation with 10 women, I think it was, including myself, talking about the links between those three things. And I put that to them, and only one woman wanted a pseudonym. And we discussed that quite thoroughly. And when it came to the publication, I did a follow-up study to look at the process and the outcome for them. And she said she was really upset. She said, I feel as if I've given my story away, and everybody else has got their own story and has claimed their own story. And we had a very big conversation about it. And I said, if it goes into another print, would you like to change that? And then she went into a kind of, oh, then it raised a whole bunch of other things that, but it was interesting because when I did the book launch and I did a sort of mini presentation of the work, I invited the people who'd written the stories to come and join in, and she came, and each of them took a few minutes to talk about the process and what it had meant. And the thing she focused on was the thing about not using her own voice, and how she did put her own voice in the next time it had come around. And she realized it was much more to do with her husband and other people, rather than, she knew that all the way through she really wanted it to be her story. And it was a very interesting whole unpicking of that process of owning our own stories. But you know, having to work with, you know, people's decisions and being able for them to change those decisions if they wanted to.
Yeah,
it's complex, it's not straightforward. We mustn't assume people need to be anonymized. I think we need to have that conversation.
yeah, and I think it's really valuable, I think, as several people have said today, to include talking about research within the research itself, so
Yes.
that gets written up and shared. I'm mindful of the time, and our 3/4 of an hour is flying past. If you haven't noticed the comments go past, can I point you to the chat? There's some really interesting things going in there. I'm kind of keen to capture sort of final remarks or concluding remarks from panelists, if that's okay. Alan, could I come to you first?
Yes, so kind of what sits with me from this experience is it's in the dialogue, it's in the conversations that experiences can be drawn out. And so I'm reflecting on how I've been here and hearing and listening to others, and around my anonymity and presence. And so that is, I guess, what I'm inviting you. Let's keep talking.
Thank you. Yeah, I certainly welcome the invitation. Thank you. And Divine, could I come to you next, please?
Yeah, thank you. It's just so hard to know what to focus on. But I suppose just such a rich day. I think my own research bag is full from the dialogue today. And I think if there's anything that I'm going to focus on is capacity to take risk and to collaborate, and really think about the research questions and what I want to do. And going back to the dotted exercise we did at the start, always have to remind myself, certainly, and other colleagues to think outside the box, I think. Yeah, so such a great day, so much to reflect on, and thank you. And it's great to speak to colleagues in the panel and everyone, all the talks I attended as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Divine. And Kim?
Yes, thinking about risk, the few minutes I had with you before we met this morning, Richard, saying I felt I'd taken a bit of a risk not having a presentation to, you know, deliver, and to kind of just open myself up to whatever it was that happened. And I just want to say the risk was worth it, because I've really enjoyed the engagement with the group, and the really interesting questions and learning that there's been in the backwards and forwards between all of us and all of the other people who are here as well. So yes, that risk, I think, was worth taking, and thank you for having me.
I'm really glad you suggested presenting in the way you did, and really glad to have been involved in that. Thank you, Kim. Michelle, can I come to you, please? Your concluding thoughts.
I guess just a couple of final comments about the masters maybe being a practice, in the comment in the chat about the masters being a practice for a PhD. And there's part of me that agrees, but another part of me that wants to honour masters research in its own right as valid and valid research that contributes to the research community. So I guess I'm kind of yes, but, and not everybody's going to have the and practitioner research where it's not embedded in an institution as well as really as really valid. Again, I think my final comments for me are about risk, and today's really bolstering my readiness to take a risk in going on to the next stage of my research, but also to see that risk isn't an obligation. That I'm thinking about what I said earlier about emotional labour and the emotional labour of taking part in research as a marginalised researcher, and that no one should be obligated to use a marginalised aspect of themselves in research, but that when we do and we take that risk, there can be some real learnings for ourselves and for the therapeutic profession.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to all the panelists for taking part in this really lively debate, and the audience members who've contributed in the chat and stepped into the spotlight as well. I was aware, as I said, sort of final or concluding remarks. You know, Alan's absolutely right. You know, so this is a conversation to be continued, definitely, isn't it? And I really look forward to continuing those conversations, either with audience members or colleagues here, but as part of the Institute too. So thank you all. I'm not sure who I'm handing over to now, but I believe that the next thing on the schedule is the plenary. We're due to finish about 4:30. We're almost on time. So I don't know if Colette or anybody at Eldon Road is able to come in and rescue me, please.